So you've already seen the creation of parameters and passing arguments into them, but I want to address this explicitly and formalize our understanding. So first of all, what is a Python argument? Well, simply put, an argument is some kind of value that we pass into a function when we call it. So like we saw with our doubler function from the prior video, we simply passed in a number into the parentheses and the number doubled. Now there are two types of arguments that we can use, and we'll cover both of them over the next two videos. They essentially do the same thing, which is to pass a value into our function, but they operate in slightly different ways in terms of how we pass them into the function. Now the first type of argument is known as a positional argument, and the second are known as keyword arguments. So let's first of all take a look at positional arguments. So in the previously defined welcome function, you can see that we return message, and message is nothing other than hello and welcome, how are you? So the function is always going to return this sentence, so it's not very dynamic. So if we take a look at the previously defined welcome function and try to pass in the string Dean into parentheses, you can see that we get a type error telling us that the welcome function takes 0 positional arguments, but 1 was given. So how do we tell a function to expect arguments inside parentheses? Well, this is where we define parameters in our parentheses within the header of our function definition. Now you can think of parameters as variables that we define as part of our function. Now their purpose is to store the values that we pass in as arguments into our function. So let's say that again. We pass in arguments into parameters, and the parameters are seen as variables that we can then use in the function itself. So parameters are placed inside the parentheses when we define a new function, with each parameter separated by a comma if we have more than one. So let's create our first function using parameters, for which we'll just extend our welcome function. So inside the parentheses of the function definition, we'll put first_name as the parameter name. And this is just a variable name that will store the input from the user or program that passes the argument. I can then use this variable name or parameter inside the body of the function. So if we try to make this message a little more personal, I can delete and welcome and replace this with a set of curly braces. I can then use the .format method, and inside the format method's parentheses, I will pass in first_name. Now when I call the welcome function and this time pass in the string Dean, you can see that we now print hello Dean, how are you to the screen. Now we can use the first_name variable anywhere inside the function's body. All we need to do is pass in first_name, and this will take on the value that's passed in as an argument wherever it is referenced. Now it's worth noting that when a function finishes running, we no longer have access to the variables defined inside of the function, and we'll cover this concept when we discuss variable scope. But this is also true of parameters. So for example, if we now try to access the values stored in the parameter first_name, you can see we run into a name error telling us that first_name is not defined. So the parameters and the values passed into them will only be accessible by the function itself. Now we can define as many parameters as we like. So if we add another parameter, and we'll call this last_name, I can then put another set of curly braces after the first set, and then inside the format method I can pass in a second argument which will be last_name. If I now try to call this function and only pass in one argument, you can see we run into a type error, and it's telling us that the welcome function is missing one required positional argument, last_name. And that's because we haven't passed in a second argument into this parameter. So if I now pass in a second argument and now I'll put in Taylor, you can see we now get hello Dean Taylor, how are you? So we've defined two parameters, and then we've passed in two arguments into the parentheses of the function call. Now the order we pass the arguments into the function call matters. The first value will be assigned to the first parameter, and the second value will be assigned to the second parameter, and so on. And this is what we mean by positional arguments. we don't have to tell Python what value corresponds to what parameter, as it is purely based on the position. So putting Dean first in this function will assign the string Dean to the parameter called first_name, and Taylor would be assigned to the parameter called last_name, and these are examples of positional arguments. Now by default, Python assigns arguments to parameters in the order they are defined. So in summary, positional arguments are arguments which are passed to parameters based on their position. In other words, the order in which we pass them into a function. In the next video, we'll look at the second type of argument known as the keyword argument, which for many people is an easier way to interpret code as it explicitly assigns a value to a parameter name. So let's dive into keyword arguments in the next video.